Hello and welcome to the last webinar of the 2020 Tom Spurling Oration webinar series. My name is Professor Beth Webster and I'm Director of the Centre for Transformative Innovation here at Swinburne and your moderator for this evening. Before we start, I'd like to run through some webinar housekeeping. May I ask that you make sure that you're on mute? A recorded version of this webinar is going to be made available and we'd love to hear from you throughout the session. So please write your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Or if you prefer, at the end of the session, raise your hand and we can unmute you if you'd like to ask your question orally instead. There's also an option to upvote the questions on the Q&A box. Those of you who wish to share this evening's presentation, please use the event hashtag #TomSpurlingOration or the CTI Twitter handle @CTI_Swinburne or for LinkedIn, the @Centre for Transformative Innovation. For those of you just joining us, welcome. I'd now like to hand over to our Oration's namesake, Professor Tom Spurling, who will say a few words and introduce our keynote speaker for this evening, Professor Spurling.
Thank you very much, Beth, and a great welcome to all of the people who are listening and watching this seminar. I would note that Swinburne's Melbourne campuses are on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation. We respect the custodianship of the First Peoples, their unceded sovereignty, and we honour their elders, past, present and emerging. To have a named oration is, of course, a great honour. And before we hear from our speaker tonight, I would like to thank Professor Beth Webster, our Director of our Centre, our Pro-Vice-Chancellor, Michael Gilding, and the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Pascal Quester, for their great support of me during my second career here at Swinburne University of Technology. I believe that our previous Vice-Chancellor, Professor Linda Christensen, is in the audience tonight, and I'd like to thank her for her great support and friendship to me while she was our Vice-Chancellor. So, I may have made some contribution to innovation and innovation policy in Australia, but any contribution I've made pales into insignificance when compared to the contribution made by our speaker tonight, Mr. Bill Scales. Bill Scales has had senior executive and government positions in industry, government, and the not-for-profit sectors for more than 30 years. He involves 20 years in manufacturing centre management. He was chair and chief executive officer of the Automotive Industry Authority, chair and chief executive of the Industry Commission, which was the precursor of today's Productivity Commission. He's been the secretary of the Department of Premier and Cabinet in Victoria. For premiers of both political persuasions. He's been a member of the leadership group at Telstra and was responsible there for regulatory, government, corporate affairs and human relations. He's also been the chair, held chair and board roles for many organisations in private, public and not-for-profit sectors, covering various areas right across the economy: telecommunications, technology, ports, aged care and higher education. And in that, he was the Chancellor of our university from 2005 to 2014. He's also chaired or been a panel member of many public reviews and inquiries covering manufacturing, telecommunications, education and the not-for-profit sector, local government and energy sectors. So he's had a marvellous career and we're very keen to hear his thoughts today in what might be a controversial talk, COVID-19, the unwelcome messenger of some inconvenient economic and political truths. Can Australia create a lasting and positive economic and political legacy from COVID-19? So I hand over to Mr. Bill Scales.
Thank you, Tom, very much. And thank you for that very warm introduction. And I might say that I've come to know Tom. I knew Tom well, not well, but knew Tom prior to the last 12 months. But over the last 12 months, I think I've come to understand that Tom is all that is good about academia. He's thoughtful, he's analytical, he's curious, he supports others that are also in the academic field, he's open-minded, and he's still very, very engaged. So Tom, it is a great delight for me to be able to be part of this Oration series. Now, for those that are listening and those that are on this Zoom call, I hope you're not going to say, surely this is not another Nostradamus about COVID-19. Well, I can set you at rest. I'm not. Clarissa, could you give me the next slide, please? Just the next one. Thanks, Clarissa. Thank you. I think this is important because clearly COVID-19 may, or actually it may not, have lasting consequences on our lives. From my perspective, I think those who talk about COVID-19, quite frankly, are only guessing. From my point of view, I don't know whether you're like me, but often when I'm listening to the radio, whether I'm watching people on television, and I see people making all sorts of prognostications about what COVID-19 might mean, and I feel as though I'm shouting at the television saying to them, you actually don't know, because most of us don't know what the end result of COVID-19 will be. But I actually think what COVID-19 has actually done has exposed some very glaring gaps in the way in which we organise ourselves, the way we as society, and particularly here in Australia, organise ourselves. And I think for Australia's long-term future, we would be wise to actually begin to look at some of those questions, which I'll try and cover today. Thanks, Clarissa. So I'm actually going to cover what I'm arguing here is 3 existential challenges that I think COVID-19 has actually exposed. Now, I fully recognise that there will be more than these, but these are 3 that I think are actually quite critical. The first is, do we need more scrutiny of and say about those who are leading us? Has COVID-19 disclosed something about Australia's manufacturing capability? And then quite importantly, has there been an underlying cause for the challenges of caring for an aged population that I think was so brutally exposed by COVID-19? And I'll go into that into a bit of detail because I think it tells us quite a bit about the way in which not only we think about aging in Australia, but the way in which we might be actually putting aside those things which are just a bit too inconvenient for us to actually think about. Thanks, Clarissa. Let me start off by talking about those that are leading us. In my view, there has been quite a significant change in the way in which we think about those who lead us. There are a couple of things I think that are so obvious. I think COVID-19 has actually helped to clarify what's been now a long-standing redefinition of the role of ministerial responsibility. Think Ruby Princess, where the review that came down on Ruby Princess made it clear that it wasn't the minister who was responsible. Think about Victoria's hotel quarantine issue. Not one minister yet has accepted responsibility for that. Now, of course, they might at some stage in the future, depending on the results of the review which is being done. And I think this has been a continuing and creeping trend. Think big bats, pink bats. Think the more recent robo-debt. Again, what we would have expected under if you like, a Westminster system no longer applies in Australia. And I think the second thing that we've learned about those who lead us as a result of COVID-19 is that there are now a large group actually, and a very significant group of non-elected officials who are actually defining for us, in fact, many of the things that relate to our own economic and liberty in many ways. Now, I'm not using the word liberty in any pejorative sense. Please understand that. I'm talking about it in its broadest sense. For example, who would have thought prior to COVID-19 that a non-elected official would be able to, for all intent and purposes, determine the extent and timing of the closing of Australia's borders? Who would have actually thought that it might have been possible that a non-elected official would have been able to, in fact, advise governments and be the major determinant, quite frankly, about whether we met even dying relatives and even dying parents? Who would have thought that people like Chief Health Officer was somebody that would be put in the spotlight when most of us wouldn't have even recognised who the Chief Health Officer was, let alone the Chief Medical Officer, which also may play a role in many of these things. So I think what we've learned here is that there is some significant changes in the way in which we think about the responsibilities for governing us in a very broad sense. And that people who we wouldn't have thought about as a part of that governance process are certainly now front and centre in the way in which we think about many of these things. Thanks, Clarissa. So let me give just a couple of examples of, in addition to what I've just said, about what I see going on that now I think has been exposed by COVID-19. Now, I know this is not a new point, but Australia is no longer Westminster, nor is it Washington. Now, quite frankly, my own personal view is we're becoming much more Washington than we are Westminster. That is, principles of if you like, ministerial responsibility is more a Westminster tradition, whereas the Washington tradition is quite different. And what do we see that might have happened over the last, I think, 2 decades or so? We now have contracted public servants, again, not new. We now have the central role of the political ministerial advisor, again, not new, but I think COVID-19 has begun to bring out some of the roles that these individuals might play in some of these areas in a way which we may not have quite understood before. We are now getting, and this is somewhat controversial, I might admit, we are now getting the appointment of what I might describe as politically aligned experts to lead many central agencies, whether that's the Department of Premier and Cabinet in the States, or whether it might be the head of treasuries, both in the States and at the Commonwealth level, or whether it might be even the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet at the national level. Now, I'm hasten to add, that's not to suggest for 1 minute that any of these people are not competent or not capable, or in many ways won't provide appropriate advice and fearsome, if you like, advice to politicians. But I think what we can see is something that we wouldn't have necessarily expected 25 years ago, which was that there is to be an alignment between these individuals and the political process, which has sort of snuck up on us. And I'll come back a bit later to why I think that might be the case. And then I think we've seen something that's also quite unusual. And many of you may remember the so-called Shergold Review, which was a task force set up to look at emissions trading under the Howard government. And you will remember, I'm sure, the Henry Tax Review. Now, why do I raise that? I raise that because this is a continuation of, if you like, this significant change in the way by which these heads of public sector organisations are actually now providing advice in a way which we wouldn't have seen in the past. Now, why is this a problem? Well, it's a sort of a problem because if the head of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet is providing public advice to government, who is going to have the courage to criticise that? How does the normal process of advice to Cabinet operate in an environment like that? And then, of course, we've got the most recent discussion that went on primarily around the public service, promoted, I might say, by the Prime Minister himself. Now, again, I'm not criticising this, but I would argue that what we're seeing now is a much more obvious and different role for the public sector than we might have understood in the past. And the Prime Minister was quite clear. He was making the point to the public sector very recently that their role is to deliver. And it was the role of the politician, if you like, and the politician in conjunction with their ministerial advisor to put in place the substantial policy issues, but primarily it was the role of the public sector to deliver. That is what I think we are seeing now much more obviously and much more clearly, and I think that's a great thing, quite frankly, as a more transactional role for the bureaucracy. And that has implications for what I will talk about a bit later on. Thanks, Clarissa. I want to make this point. There's been some very interesting issues that have been raised about the role of institutions. And Campbell, a great scholar around the whole question of what are institutions and how do institutions change over time. And you don't have to read this, but the general point that he's making is that often institutions like bureaucracies, like governments, like democracies, change quite radically, even though we don't necessarily understand that it's happening at the time. And they change radically because that change comes about slowly. And then we look back on those changes and then we ask ourselves, how did that change come about? And it came about because we weren't clear about what was actually going on at the time. And that's what I would argue has been going on, particularly within this issue about the role of government, the role of the advisor, the role of the public service, and by implication, the way we are now governed. Thanks, Clarissa. And so the question that comes from that, of course, and this is not the only question, but the big question that comes from this is, should we have more scrutiny over these non-elected officials who determine our welfare, who actually can affect many of the things that we regarded as simply being our rights? That is, to be able to visit our friends and relatives, to be able to cut across state borders, to be able to determine many of our own rights and our own responsibilities. So the question is, should we change the way many of these public officials are selected? Should we go down the role, something like we see, of course, and we're about to see writ large in the United States? That is some form of confirmation process. Or, for example, should we ask politicians to tell us at the time of an election who it is that's going to be part of their particular and important delivery mechanism, if you like, those transactional operators that are going to deliver those important policy programs that governments will put in front of us. Let me give you a practical and most recent example. Many of you would have seen the Victorian state budget. Many of you would be aware, of course, that the Victorian state budget outlines that over the next 4 years, Victoria will spend $20 billion per year for the next 4 years, total of $80 billion on infrastructure spend. Now, the question is, who's going to do that? Who's going to be held accountable? If we can't rely on ministers to be held accountable, who do we hold accountable? Should we have some say in these individuals through the process that I'm talking about here? Maybe a confirmation process, or maybe we ask governments when they are asking to be elected to tell us who it is that are going to be in charge of these important bits of public policy. Because I can pretty well guarantee that the next time there is an election in Victoria, or in particular in Victoria, or nationally, there will be a number of quite specific programs that we will be asked to sign on to. In the states, it'll be around policing, it'll be around health, it'll be around education, and it'll be around infrastructure. Because they're so important to the states, why shouldn't we know who it is that's going to deliver those if we can't hold ministers accountable? Thanks, Clarissa. Let me move on to another subject, and that is Australia's manufacturing capability. And what have we learned about Australia's manufacturing capability through COVID-19? Well, quite frankly, my own view is not very much at all. What I think we have learned, however, is that in times of crisis, the resources needed to cope are not always immediately available. And of course, we've seen some quite celebrated examples of this, haven't we? We've seen the personal protective equipment issue. We've seen respirators. And of course, we've had a great laugh about the great toilet paper issue. But of course, what we're not sure about is what that is really about. Is it about Australia's manufacturing capability, or is it something else? Thanks, Clarissa. So my own view is it's actually not about manufacturing at all, even though I know that there are many voices that are actually arguing that what this disclosed was a particular issue around manufacturing capability. But I think the real question is, what is the problem that we're actually trying to solve? For example, does Australia have a manufacturing capability issue, or a preparedness issue, or maybe a combination of both? My own view is we don't actually have a manufacturing capability, which I'll come back to in a minute, nor do we, I think, have necessarily a supply issue. But I think it is quite possible that Australia has a preparedness issue. And I think that's something that Australia really has to get its head around, because if the experts are right, and I suspect they are, and this won't be the last of the pandemics that we see, certainly during my lifetime and during my grandchildren's lifetime, then I don't think we can actually accept that the lack of preparedness that we saw during this pandemic should apply in the next. Or are we concerned about the reliability of the firms from our major trading nations? Or are we concerned about the capability and resilience of our existing manufacturing base? So let me just cover those two things. Thanks, Clarissa. So let's just ask the question, are we actually worried about the reliability of the firms from our major trading nations? Is that the issue that we're mainly worried about? And if that is the question that we're worried about, then I thought what I'd do is actually just take a list of our top 10 countries by imports, our partners by imports. And let's just, and I'm not going to go through every one of these, but let's just think China is a special case right now, but even with China, and remember that even though we talk about China as being a supplier of goods to Australia, what we're actually talking about are Chinese firms. In the same way as we talk about the United States or the Republic of Korea or Thailand or the United Kingdom, we often talk about it as though it's a country. But what we're actually talking about are the firms within those countries. So are we actually saying that there is a lack of reliability about the firms in those countries and their ability to provide us with the imports that we might need in the future? I don't think that's actually what we are saying, because I actually haven't yet come across any real evidence that Australia has actually had to ration any of the particular goods or services that might have come from any of those nations. Now, of course, there have been, a few minor inconveniences along the way, but if I take my own experience as an example, things have come in the mail, food has arrived, we've had things delivered by Australia Post very efficiently, I might say. It doesn't seem to me that on the face of it, Australia has a manufacturing capability issue, and it doesn't seem to me that Australia has a problem with its main trading nations in relation to the goods or services that it would normally apply. So it seems to me that COVID-19 hasn't done anything that to expose a problem in particular around manufacturing capability. Now, that's not to suggest that there isn't a problem around Australia's manufacturing capability, but I can't see that actually COVID-19 has exposed that. Now, it is true that what we saw initially was issues around personal protective equipment, PPE, and we did see some issues around respirators. But what we also saw, if you'll remember, that those issues were managed relatively quickly. And you also remember that particularly in relation to respirators, Australia had something like about 1,600 respirators right across the country. And it was estimated that we would need something like 6,000. Australian manufacturing were able to supply, with a fair amount of support, I might say, by government, those 6,000 were required. So on the face of it, it seems to me that COVID-19 hasn't actually disclosed that Australia has a manufacturing capability problem. Thanks, Clarissa. But let's say we do have a manufacturing capability problem. And I thought it'd be worthwhile just covering this briefly so that I can't just to address that matter in the event that it might be. And what are some of the options if that's the case? Of course, we continue with what effectively the Hawke and Keating government did during their period, which, as you would know, generated something like 28 years of continuous economic growth. What the Hawke and Keating government did, they opened up the economy. They made sure that there was efficient macro and microeconomic policy settings. They put in place appropriate and efficient, in conjunction with the states and territories, physical and social infrastructure. And they made sure that there were appropriate supporting institutions, clearly like the Reserve Bank, clearly like the Productivity Commission, clearly like the Grants Commission, and so on, and gave them the support that they needed to make sure that that open economy could work effectively for all industries. We could also put in place option one, plus put in place significant generally available productivity improving support for Australian industry sectors by making sure that, for example, research and development and workplace relations regulation and education and training support was adequate. Or maybe we could go to option three, which is the same as option 1 and 2, but put in place specific assistance for manufacturing. Maybe option 4, which is 1 and 2, plus special assistance for a small number of industries associated with Australia's strategic priorities, which in essence is what we're beginning to see through the Australian government's most recent approach to supporting industry. Or, again, we've seen the Australian government move to some special arrangements for what I might describe as government-selected national champions, particularly in relation to looking at how we might address COVID-19. Thanks, Clarissa. Let me then move on to another subject, which is the question of caring for the aged. I think it's obvious, and this is not a new point, that Australia's system of caring for our aged is clearly no longer fit for purpose. As I said, this is not a new insight, but I think COVID-19 has highlighted the extent of the challenge, but it's not clear to me that we've actually fully understood yet the causes of this challenge, and I'm not sure that we understand the solution to this challenge. And so that's what I want to actually cover next. Thanks, Clarissa. But let me just give you a few facts. I'm sorry to have to do this, but I want to go through a few facts, and then I want to bring those facts together in a way which might make a bit of sense. Let's just talk about what's happened in regard to COVID-19 and aged care. If we take the total number of cases and deaths from COVID-19, nearly 28,000 cases, or there were at November 13 when I began to prepare these slides, and the number of deaths were 907. If we look at the cases and deaths in residential aged care, so the distinction here is in relation to residential aged care from COVID-19, what do we see? We see the number of cases, a little over 2,000. We saw the number of deaths at 685. Therefore, the number of deaths as a proportion of the number of cases in aged care was 33%, the same percent as we saw in Victoria. But here's the final rub in regard to this bit of data. The deaths of those in residential aged care as a percent of the total deaths from COVID-19 is 76%. What does this tell me? This tells me that COVID-19 didn't create a problem of deaths for people who are aging. It created a problem about it exposed a problem about our aged care, residential aged care system. And I make that distinction. It's about residential aged care. Thanks, Clarissa. The next bit of data that I thought I would do, again, in relation to caring for the aged, is give you a sense of what's actually happening and what has happened over the last few years. First of all, this is the issue in aged care is not new to anybody. 15 national reviews of aged care since 1997. People knew there was a problem of aged care. COVID-19 simply was able to fully expose it. But there's been a changing nature of aged care right across Australia. In 2017-18, there were 1.2 million people receiving some form of aged care package from government. There were 783 or nearly 800,000 receiving what's called a home support package. That is, they were supporting people in their home care. They really weren't ill by any means, but they were being supported by government in some form or another to make sure their lawns were mowed, to make sure their windows were clean, any minor maintenance. And then there were around about 270,000, close to 300,000, who were actually in residential aged cares and were receiving a residential aged care package. And very interestingly, and the highest growth area is around about a little over 100,000 people who are receiving what's called a home care package, as distinct from a home support package, to be clear. That home care package is a package to keep people who would normally go into residential aged care in their home. So we're seeing a significant change in the way in which that's aged care is operating across Australia. The last sort of data point, if you like, in regard to aged care, is what we're now observing is that most that are now entering residential aged care are really high care. Now, let me just go back for 2 nanoseconds here. Aged care is, and particularly residential aged care, is a relatively new phenomenon. It was really invented, if I could use that word, sometime around the middle 1960s. It was invented because the health system realised they needed to take people out of the hospital system and care for them in another environment because the hospital system wasn't dealing with them well. What we're now observing is that most people who are going into residential aged care are now high care. That is, they're needing either pre or, in many cases, close to palliative care. Thanks, Clarissa. This is another data point. Now, this is a little complicated, but let me go through it with you. This is a graph produced by the Productivity Commission in 2013 when it was doing a research into aging. On the left-hand axis, you have dollars per person, but contributed by government. On the y-axis, you have age. So if you go along the y-axis, that is by age, what will be clear to you is that as people get to the age of around about 60, the contribution by government to people who are aging increases dramatically. It increases in both health, age pension, and aged care. Now, in 2013 dollars, by the time you get to the age of around about 85 to 90, the dollars per person in aged care contributed by government is around about somewhere between $70,000 per person per year. So just keep that in the back of your mind just for a moment. Thanks, Clarissa. So I'm going to give you a bit more data in a minute, but I just want to explain where this data comes from. Every 5 years, the government produces what it calls an intergenerational report. This report is an important report because what it does is try to bring together a lot of data about the effect that government policies are affected by Australia's population growth and age profile. So that's the intergenerational report. And I'm bringing now, thanks Clarissa, some data that comes from the most recent intergenerational report. Thanks Clarissa. The most recent intergenerational report, which is the 2015 report, told us this. In 1974-5, 1% of Australia's population, or around 80,000 people, were aged 85 or over. It also told us that in 2005, there were about, in 2054-5, there will be about 4.5%, or around 2 million people who will be 85 or over in the Australian population. So again, just keep that in the back of your mind. Thanks, Clarissa. The intergenerational report also said that in 1974, there were 7.4 people for every one person 65 or over. In 2015, there were 4.5 for everyone 65 and over. But by 2055, there will be only 2.7 for every person 65 and over. Thanks, Clarissa. So what are the implications, therefore, from all of this information about aged care? The question is, what is the model now for aged care? Is it to be what I might describe as a hospitality model? That is, people will go into aged care and simply have most of the freedoms which they normally expect, but somebody will provide them with a very comfortable bed and high quality meals. Or are we now talking about a medical model? A model more like we saw prior to the beginning of our current aged care model, where people who go into aged care are now greatly in need of medical care. If that's the model, then our current model is simply not fit for purpose. Because if we're going into a medical care model, we probably should have all of our residential aged care facilities supported by hospitals. They probably should have at least one doctor. They probably should have at least one chemist, depending on their size, of course. Of course, the next question is who will be caring for the aged as Australia itself ages? So if that information that you saw from the intergenerational report is right, and we only have around 3 people for every person over 65 by 2050, who's going to care for the aged? Of course, it raises a whole range of other questions about who's going to be actually providing a range of goods and services for Australia. So for those who actually want to debate the question of Australia's immigration program, they have to confront that question. They have to confront the issues, assuming, of course, intergenerational report is right. They have to confront the issues the intergenerational report is telling us. And then, of course, in relation to aged care, there's this very important question is who's going to pay? Is it going to be the individual? Is it going to be government? If it's government, we saw what it means if every person over the age of 85 or around about 80 is going to cost the government, if you like, something around about $70,000 per year, and the number of people who are aging is increasing, who's going to pay for that? And then what is the role for each level of government? My own view in terms of aged care is the current governance arrangements is simply not sustainable. In my view, if we have to go to a medical model for aged care, that's probably best done by the states. And that is because the expertise in relation to medical care is held by the states. And the capability for looking after the medical system is held by the states. Thanks, Clarissa. Thanks, Clarissa. So let me summarise. I think there are some certain lessons from COVID-19, but I don't know the answers, and I'm not sure that anybody does. There are many challenges that have been exposed by COVID-19, but I think many of those challenges were there all of the time, but we actually just weren't aware of them. But we should have been, and we should have been more alert to some of these questions. However, we didn't recognise them at the time, and for some of them, in particular aged care, I think we chose to ignore them. Thanks, Clarissa. So finally, what's my simple plea? My simple plea is less politics, more science, less planning, less panic, more planning. To acknowledge and understand that we need to address the structural elements of the matters which have been disclosed by COVID-19. And my last plea is that for you and for people who know, when the next intergenerational report comes out in 2021, can I ask you to please look at it, digest it, and come to your own conclusions about what this might mean for Australia of the future. Thank you. Beth, I think you're on mute.
Thank you very much, Bill, for that fantastic presentation. Can I ask people to put their questions in the Q&A sort of button down the bottom of your screen? While we're waiting for the questions to come in, I'd like to start off with a question of my own. So getting back to your first issues of ministers taking responsibility, do you think it's got lessened over time? Has it always been an issue? And if you think it has reduced over time, is there a reluctance of the public servants not to tell their political masters bad news? You know, we sort of heard a little bit about that with the pink bats, and it's certainly not something that's specific to the public service. We heard about it with the banks. You know, the people at the top of the bank weren't hearing bad news about some of the things that were going on down at the grassroots. Do you think that problem's always been there, or do you think it's getting worse?
I think it's new, Beth. I think it's new. What I'm about to say is public, because I was asked, as it turned out, by Malcolm Turnbull when he was Prime Minister, to do, if you like, a review of the public policy process for the establishment of NBN-Co. And one of the glaring issues around the development of NBN-Co was the lack of contribution by the public service. The only public service group that was involved in the initial establishment of NBN-Co was the Department of Finance. And that's in my report. Department of Treasury was almost absent. The Department of Prime Ministers was absent. The Department of Communications was there at the margin. The decision to actually establish what then was Australia's largest ever infrastructure project was determined in less than 3 months by 4 ministers, primarily on their own, with some support from the Department of Finance, to make sure that it wasn't put on to make sure that the establishment of it wasn't put on the Australia's balance sheet. But there was almost no other contribution by the public service. So I think what we're seeing is a significant change, and it's an unwelcome change. Now, that's not to suggest for 1 minute that putting public servants on contract is a bad thing. But I think we actually have to get back to the point where good advice is provided and accepted and made public if necessary.
Right, so I've got a question here from Robin, who says, given the corner cutting and profit taking that inevitably happens in the for-profit and in the not-for-profit aged care, should aged care be in anything other than a government-controlled sector?
Well, I think the not-for-profit sector and the for-profit sector are different. Now, I don't think it's actually the profit per se. I think it's actually the regulatory environment that is in fact the problem, number one. And secondly, the point that I was making about the way by which aged care has changed means that the way by which the kind of organisation which is actually running aged care today might be quite different than you would have running aged care if it was actually a medical model. I think, for example, if you actually were operating under a medical model, the ethos and the culture of medical institutions is quite different to what we might see in other forms of organisations. So you could actually ask the same question of hospitals, of for-profit hospitals. But do we see the same concern about for-profit hospitals? No. And there are many outstanding for-profit hospitals. So I actually don't think it's actually whether it's a for-profit, not-for-profit, or even government. I think it's the nature of the system itself. We have to actually address the nature of the system itself and then get the governance right to be able to make sure that aged care in the future is appropriate.
Michael Gilding's got a question. He says, as I recall, Australia has a long history of statutory authorities making decisions rather than politicians, going back to the early 20th century. thinking here, Board of Works is a classic one. Isn't this consistent with the current role of public servants that you have described?
Well, I think there was a difference between independent statutory authorities. And I mean, you picked the Board of Works, for example. And, you know, because we're here in Victoria, you could talk about, you know, you could talk about the SECV and so on. And the question, I think, there is, you know, what is the appropriate role for statutory authorities? It's not that statutory authorities are good or bad. It's the question of whether statutory authorities are the right sort of institution for the circumstances. And I think over time, what we've come to understand is that there are some statutory authorities which are particularly important, but there are others which are probably best, where we're best able to actually get the best use out of the resources, but them not being in necessarily government hands. Let me give you a practical example. I think we recognise that transport is probably ought to be a hybrid. But what we actually need, particularly for our rail systems, is a sensible way by which government owns some elements of the rail system, but the private sector can be involved in others. Whereas in relation to energy, for example, it's not clear that there's any longer much of a role in the delivery and the production of energy, but there is in some of the monopoly elements of energy. So I think, again, it's actually looking at the circumstances, then asking oneself, what is the appropriate governance arrangement for the circumstances?
So are you basically saying there should be greater rules about what politicians can do unfettered and what they can't do? I mean, you know, are you saying the rules are breaking down or too grey or too open to manipulation?
Well, my point is greater transparency.
Just greater transparency.
It seems to me, and more people who are informing themselves about the sort of things that I was talking about earlier, the public at large, around things like the intergenerational report and some of these others, and understanding the consequences of that. That's what my argument is, that the greater level of scrutiny, and that's why I'm arguing in favour of some form of process whereby we understand who it is who is going to actually be the decision makers in many of these important areas in the future. I mean, I want to know who's going to be in charge of health in the future. I want to know who's actually going to be the person who's going to potentially close off the borders in the future. I want to know whether they're competent. I want to know whether they're likely to be a political apparatchik or whether they're actually capable people who are going to stand up to politicians. I need to know that. And I need to know that before they're actually appointed.
You're probably in a very good position to be able to make those calls and judge the sort of person that they're putting forward, but would the average person be able to make that judgment?
Well, the average person has lots of information available for them to do it. I mean, if we do have a free press and if we have places like the ABC and others that can scrutinise these matters, then that's the way it will be done. And that's why other institutions have to play their part as well. I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that this is easy, but it seems to me that the direction we've been going is not the right direction, and we need to have much greater scrutiny over many of these decisions and the way they're made and who makes them.
Beth, can I ask you a question?
Oh, yes, you may, Tom.
Well, can I go back to your discussion of the public service and the changes that have taken place over the years? My recollection was that when I was in the office of the Minister for Resources and Energy in 1985, the senior bureaucrats in the Department of Resources and Energy had intimate technical and personal knowledge of the industry. My impression now is that with the mega departments and the more generalized nature of the skills of senior public servants, that's probably changed. Do you think that the formation of large departments of having public servants transfer from one department to the other and so on has had any effect on the issues that you're talking about?
Tom, I think there's no doubt about that. And I think if we go to the heart of this issue, it's the one I mentioned earlier, that what we're now getting is a public service that is transactional. If a public service is transactional, then we must expect that the people who are running those departments, delivering on those services, know exactly what they're doing. And it underlines the point that I was making about greater scrutiny, that we as a community ought to know that they're capable of doing that. We ought to be aware of what their skills are. We shouldn't expect that simply because they are a public servant, that gives them the capability of being able to deliver what we're going to have in Victoria, which is $80 billion worth of public infrastructure.
So you're suggesting that we need more experts in senior roles in the public servants and less generals? I think we have to have that. Yeah. I think, if you take the health system as an example, there is no question that the health system is becoming more and more complex. We need people in charge of our health system who understands not only the way the health system works, but the culture of the health system, the ethos of the health system. If I go back one step, when people talk to me about the public service, I ask them a question. Which public service are you talking about? Are you talking about policymakers? Are you talking about administrators? Are you talking about custodians of the system? Those people that are auditors, those people that are a part of the various determinants of whether there is ethical behaviour or not? Are you talking about service providers, nurses, teachers, that sort of group? Because until you answer that question, I can't answer the question, what sort of leadership is required? And I can't even answer the question, what are the labour market arrangements which are best for individuals within those particular areas of the public service? So the point I'm making here, at one level, the public service is becoming much more complex for all of the implicit reasons that I've just mentioned. At the other level, we're expecting generalizable capabilities to be able to run those departments, and I don't think that's good enough. So just on a related theme, we've got a comment or question here from Jeff Hull, who says, Bill, how should we improve the transparency of policy advice? Do you think Cabinet submissions should be published like they are in New Zealand?
I think there's no question about that. It's been an ongoing issue for many people involved in public policy for quite some time. And there's a number of elements to this. There is actually no reason why documents determining how policy was made should not be made public. There is actually no reason, if I go one step further, why when particular funds are provided to firms, the government shouldn't release that information immediately it's provided to the firm. There is no, and I've looked at this in great detail when I was chair of the Industry Commission. There is absolutely no issue around that in terms of confidentiality. But even if there was, it's community money that's being spent, and the community ought to know what money's being spent on their behalf. And they ought to know that they're getting real value for money if governments are handing out our money for other purposes. Transparency is critical for high quality government, is critical.
So continuing on this theme, Robin and Margaret Hartley have both said things like, is the power of ministerial advisors overriding policy advice from departments and public service growing too great? And is it eroding ministerial responsibility within the policy development for the government?
Well, there's no question, and it's part of the point that I was trying to allude to when I quoted Campbell. The whole question of the political advisor is now embedded in the political process. And the political advisor, many of them very, very capable individuals, by the way.
But there are hundreds of them for every minister, often.
Oh, well, not hundreds, I wouldn't say. Not hundreds for every minister. But,
for some ministers.
But there are a number of them. And those ministerial advisors are now taking a critical role and have critical positions in the public policy making process. But they're involved in the process, but they're not accountable within the process. My argument is they should be. Now, I'm not suggesting here that there's a subtlety here. I think it's reasonable that a minister should appoint their own political advisor, but the political advisor should be held accountable for the decisions that are made by that political advisor. At the moment, we don't hold them accountable, but we should. And they should be prepared to be held accountable for the decisions that they're involved in. But at the moment, they're not.
So just thinking now to the aged care issue, Margaret Hartley's got a question. She says, what's your view of Paul Keating's comments that superannuation is not adequate to cover people once they're in their 80s? And as a medical model of aged care is emerging, that Australia may need to look at a new tax or levy sort of Medicare for these very elderly, but growing population.
Putting aside, I think the Keating issue is primarily around super, as distinct from the question of who pays for aged care. Now, I know they're related, but if you argue that super should be used to support you in aged care, then the law has to change. There's no question about that. And a more there has to be an approach that actually brings that about. But I think the broader question is that if we don't find a way by which individuals pay for more of their aged care, then Australia in general will have to actually accept greater taxes. So it'll either be greater taxes or people pay for more of their aged care. And whether that's through super or some other form, I think that's a matter for greater discussion in the future.
We've got time for just one more question. This comes from Michael Gilding, just on a slightly different tack. So he said, you've identified a number of options in industry policy. Where do you think we should land? And should we have national champions?
Well, I think first of all, there's been lots of debate around sort of industry, or what they call overseas industrial policy. Every country has an industrial policy. So I'm not in the area that says Australia shouldn't have an industrial policy, because it will have one, and that's the reality. But some industrial policies or industry policies can be highly distorting. And the biggest thing we need to worry about with an industry policy is the way in which it actually potentially undermines the real success stories. Because every time a government picks a particular industry or industry sector for support, it's sending a signal. It's sending a signal to parents about where their children should be employed. It's sending a signal to banks. It's sending a signal to universities about how they should go about educating people and so on. It's sending a lot of signals, and those signals can actually generate their own inefficiencies. So I think from my point of view, the safest thing is to actually treat all industries appropriately and allow those industries to be able to succeed under the auspices of the thing I put down in option 1. That is high quality public policy, high quality monetary policy, sound government programs around education, sound government programs around taxing and so on. That's where I would put my effort and make sure that they operate well. And it's not an ideological point. It's the point I made right at the beginning. If we want to know what worked under a Hawke and Keating government, that's what works. And if we want to know something that works well, just look at history.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. But I'd now like to hand over to Dr. Ian Sayre, who's going to make a vote of thanks. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you, Beth. And Bill, on behalf of the audience for this third leg of the 2020 Tom Spurling Oration, I'd like to thank you very much for your most insightful presentation on whether Australia can create a lasting and positive economic and political legacy from COVID-19. I think what you presented to us was an excellent complement to the previous 2 presentations we had over the last couple of weeks from respectively John Brumby and Sue Richardson. I was very interested in your very clear articulation of what you said were 3 existential challenges for Australia, noting that they weren't caused by COVID-19, but rather were highlighted by it. It was a very interesting expose of leadership in the political arena that we currently face in Australia, with ministerial responsibility diminishing as the role of non-elected officials has increased. And of course, we've seen that particularly with the role played by our Chief Health Officer here in Victoria and then Chief Medical Officers in the other states. Your discussion of Australia's manufacturing capability, I thought, was most apposite, particularly the fact that you highlighted that you didn't think we had a problem with our domestic capability, but rather with a lack of preparedness, as we saw with our inability to instantly be able to source PPE. And the third leg of your discussion around aged care not being fit for purpose, it's clear from the intergenerational studies that you quoted that the trends have been evident for quite some time and have continued to emerge. But the situation that we've faced this year with COVID-19 has certainly highlighted problems with the current governance arrangements. So in all, I think your articulation of what COVID has done to underscore longer term trends in some major elements of Australian society was very interesting. And for me as a scientist, I particularly like that byline of yours, we need less politics and more science. That certainly is something that appealed to me. So thank you again for a most thought-provoking speech. And I'd ask all of the participants, although you can't see them, Bill, to applaud you and thank you in the usual way.
Thank you, great. And I should have introduced Ian. He was the former Deputy Chief Defence Scientist here in Australia. So thank you to everyone attending this session and our previous webinars in this series. Thank you and good evening. And I hope to see you all in 2021.